One man sold the ocean, the $50 billion betrayal. His gloves squeaked on steel. 6 tons of secrets hovered in black water. Above him, USS Halibut lay on her skis welded to a spy, pressed into the seafloor like a breathing shadow. One mistake and the Sea of Okhotsk would bloom with propellers and floodlights. He eased a 6-ton induction pod around a Soviet cable physics said was untouchable. No splice, no cut, just magnetism, stealing whispers through insulation that never felt the theft. A red lamp winked. In Petropavlovsk, voices kept talking. They didn't know the ocean had started listening. What that pod hauled out would rewrite patrols, budgets, and trust. You think the Cold War was won by missiles and speeches. Here's the twist. One man sold the ocean, and an invisible wiretap taught Washington how the Soviets actually breathed at sea. So who really owned the water? The divers who risked detection and wore to clamp a 6-ton induction pod onto a cable no one would admit existed? Or the insider who, years later, walked into a foreign embassy with debt on his back and sold the map? The how, the where, the rhythm of retrievals, so the other side could pull the plug. That's the question we chase. The emotional stakes lived in pressure and routine. Boats that slid under ice and lay still for days. Crews who learned to treat silence like a schedule. Officers who planned routes to avoid one sonar ping and then relied on scraps of copper carrying unencrypted policy between a submarine base and fleet headquarters. It was an invisible heist, magnetic induction, not a single cut. The Soviets didn't encrypt because they believed physics protected them. That belief fed Washington's appetite. Each storage swap, each power cycle, another month of plans and doctrine in a can. But secrets grow heavy. On land, a former NSA specialist with $65,000 in debt and an alias, Mr. Long, told himself he was just offering context. Not codes, not names, just how we listened. Meanwhile, far at sea, Halibut's skegs let her park on the bottom without a sound, divers working in red light as if time couldn't touch them. They thought the pod was the magic. It was. The magic was that the ocean kept talking because the cable never felt a wound. What nobody knew yet was how brittle that confidence was. In 1981, satellites spotted Soviet salvage ships loitering right over the tap site. A shadow moved. The pod went missing. The Sea of Okhotsk felt wrong. Tasking shifted. Analysts argued ocean versus compromise. Families learned deployments could stretch for reasons briefs wouldn't print. This isn't a museum story. It's a ledger. The taps, the halls, the betrayal, the bill. We'll rewind to the night the ocean spoke, show how they found a needle on the seabed, and why induction, not a knife, unlocked a fleet. We'll follow the kitchen phone call that turned gold into silence, and the overhead images that proved a secret had been harvested. Then we'll ask what it means now, when 99% of your life rides glass threads across dark water. The dramatic question is simple. Where does trust live when the ocean can lie? The night the ocean spoke. They never said tap, not on Halibut, not out loud. It was the package, the can, the hardware. On the chart it lived as a pencil cross, then nothing, just water. Then steel met silt. USS Halibut eased down on her skegs, welded skis bolted to a spy so she could sit on the bottom without advertising it. Pumps rode shock mounts. Footsteps learned rubber. The captain whispered orders like sound could climb steel and report to Petropavlovsk. Up there, officers drank tea and used a shore cable they believed physics protected. Down here, a diver in a red washlight hugged 6 tons of steel built to call them liars. First jaw, then second. Hands remembering a drill the brain tried to forget. No splice, no cut, just magnetism. The 6-ton induction pod wrapped the cable like a careful thief and listened by physics, tickling the cable's field through insulation, drawing a ghost of current from a wire that never felt a wound. He paused, not for drama, for pressure, the way your ribs argue after too long in cold water. A small red lamp winked once. He breathed once, twice, and pushed away. Above, the boat became a lung that refused to exhale. A petty officer mouthed counts instead of speaking. 1, 2, 3, time sliced thin, so you didn't think about patrols overhead or nets that could snag a periscope like a finger through a loop. The plan was drawn in rooms with no windows. Approach in eddies. Ride the backside of a thermocline. Park where the seabed turned firm. Those skegs weren't decoration. They were legs, letting 5,000 tons of submarine rest without thrashing water into gossip. Get this, nobody wanted heroics. The trick wasn't planting the pod. It was never having been there at all. That meant route planning like choreography. They rehearsed cable logic the way a conductor studies tempo. Cables hate rock and trenches. They love gentle slopes, stable sediment, geology that doesn't grind a sheath into confession. Halibut's navigator ran fingers along isobaths and asked, "What does a hurried Soviet surveyor do with a barge in bad weather and a schedule to keep?" That answer built the path. The diver came back in slow, body heat traded for a blanket and a joke that didn't land. The compartment smelled like metal and coffee. Someone grinned at the tiny lamp as if it were a newborn. Nobody clapped. The captain rubbed the bridge of his nose. "We're late," he said, though they were. Late was a word to keep a heart from sprinting. They lifted off the bottom like a prayer you say in your head, not your mouth. Here's the human side of an invisible theft. The first haul didn't sing, it stacked. Strips, tapes, transcriptions turned the Sea of Okhotsk into a room. Exercise schedules, movement orders. The tone a duty officer used when maybe had to sound like sure. A junior analyst in a windowless shop wrote down a phrase that didn't match doctrine, quietly thrilled and a little sick at the power of knowing a secret at its source. On boats and bases, nothing changed. That was the point. If the cable didn't feel a wound, why encrypt? Why suspect? Halibut learned a rhythm, approach windows, storage swaps, battery cycles. Divers treated silence like a schedule. The pod wasn't a trophy, it was a timepiece, and the ocean kept its own calendar. Crews measured themselves against that metronome. A fixer greased a latch because it squeaked on a Tuesday swell. A radio man taped don'ts under his console. Don't overtransmit, don't trust luck, don't talk about the can. While steel kissed Pacific floor, the map upstairs got cleaner. Cable finding turned into craft. Sonar stopped being sound and started being stories. A faint line that wasn't sand ripple, a slope that suggested a barge ladder once scraped by. Halibut's skegs kissed the same patch, so often the silt learned their outline. It sounds romantic. It was. It was minutes measured by how long you could go without breathing wrong. They rotated crews like a sacrament. Fresh hands learned to move slow, veterans learned to say less. A chief told a kid, "If you're about to be proud, stop." The kid laughed, then didn't. Pride lives loud. This mission liked quiet. Risk threaded everything. A fishing trawler cut a safe lane without meaning to. A patrol sub hummed overhead for 5 minutes too long. A seal bumped metal and made 3 men flinch. Mammals don't file flight plans. The captain carried a choice in his pocket every second. Break off and go, or trust the schedule. He chose trust because that's how you finish things worth doing. Then the ocean spoke. Not thunder, paper, stacks that made Okhotsk a conference room. The brief didn't sing, it listed. Names, dates, timings. Someone underlined a habit twice and circled a change once. The underlines built confidence. The circle built appetite. Nobody knew time had become a third player. Every lamp that blinked on a can started a clock in a stranger's kitchen far away, in a city where debts grew teeth. But on this night, in red light and rubber, the ocean gave up a first sentence. The boat rose. The captain finally exhaled. Somewhere up that copper, a message went out like any other day. And for the first time, it didn't belong to the people who sent it. Finding the needle, how they found the cable. Finding a Soviet cable in an ocean the size of a continent wasn't luck. It was behavior. You start with scraps, dockside rumors about a barge that never fished, a Soviet temporary exclusion zone winked into notices, a maintenance tender that always refueled on Thursdays, and you stitch a guess that can live underwater. The guess has to pass physics. Cables don't like mountains. They prefer gentle slopes, stable sediment, seabeds that won't grind a sheath into confession. Think like a surveyor with a deadline, and you can think like a cable. The crew learned to read seafloor the way aviators read weather. Isobaths became handwriting. A smooth contour near a military harbor wasn't pretty, it was policy grouted into geology. A young navigator tapped a pencil on a chart. "If I had a barge and a boss, I'd drop here." The captain didn't smile. He shifted the plot 2 miles south. "The boss is late. The swell's wrong. You hug the lee." That was the path Halibut took. Halibut's skegs made belief practical. Without them, she'd hover and fuss, announcing herself with microstorms in sand. With them, she settled. 4 steel fins, welded like legs onto a fish that learned to crawl, let her park without telling the ocean she was there. Each landing rehearsed silence. Trim valves hissed through filters. Pumps floated on shock mounts. Human feet learned rubber like religion. When she kissed the bottom, the silt didn't argue. Sonar was the second religion. Not Hollywood ping, side scan blur, faint ridges, patterns nature doesn't write. An operator traced a ghost line across a waterfall of dots and said nothing. 2 hours and 3 passes later, that repeat isn't sand. Sand forgets. Cables remember being laid. A bite in the bathymetry that bent the wrong way hinted at a barge ladder once dragged. That scar set bearings. Up where maps breathe air, analysts built scaffolding. The cable had to tie Petropavlovsk to Vladivostok, a straight line that wasn't straight because politics bends to geology. Fishing charts, hydrographic surveys, dredging notices, grid built. A tiny red flag pinned on a curtainless wall. Start here, she said, not because she knew, but because the math did. Micro stories mattered. A watchstander circled a smudge that held steady despite tide predictions. He marked it with a question mark because the ocean punishes certainty. A week later, a second smudge kissed the first from a different bearing. 2 coincidences make a plan. The chief looked once and wrote, "Run," in the margin. Get this, cable logic is human logic wearing a wetsuit. Soviet barge crews avoided rocks because nobody wants to write reports. They hugged contours because fuel gets counted by men who shout. They staged near warm food and watch officers who loved routine. The cable took the path of least paperwork. Halibut's navigator traced that path with a finger that had learned bureaucracy through water. Finding the needle meant not being the magnet. That's where skegs and choreography earn pay. Approach on the dark side of a thermal layer where sound curves away from curious ears. Slow ahead wasn't slow. It was breath held for minutes that felt like hours. The pilot watched the depth gauge like a cardiologist. A hair low, and the keel writes its own story in silk. A hair high, and propwash gossips. He threaded between hairs. Divers didn't go until the boat earned quiet. Red light and a hand signal carry more authority than a shout when the wrong ears might be listening. First run laid whispers, a pebble here, a tiny grapnel there. When those markers reappeared on the second and third pass, confidence moved from maybe to yes. Announcements are for after-action reports. This game prefers nods. The best clue didn't come from the sea. It came from paper nobody should have seen. A Soviet tender's maintenance schedule listed line checks on intervals that made no sense for valves. Lines meant cables. The dates matched weather windows that turn aqua into asphalt. Overlay with bathymetry and 3 zones glowed. Halibut visited all 3. Only one felt like intent turned to metal. Once they thought they had it, they did the opposite of celebrate. They waited. Currents shift. Sand wanders. A real cable shows up the same way in bad moods and good. The second pass saw it. The third proved it. The fourth was for humility. Then the captain said, "Work," and routine became theft. The crew's lesson became doctrine in rooms they'd never see. You don't find secrets by chasing them. You find habits that can only exist if secrets are nearby. Cables avoid pain. Men avoid paperwork. Water avoids angles. Put those together and a needle starts to float. Halibut eased off her skegs like a cat leaving a warm spot. The chart gained a line that wasn't ink. Somewhere above, a Soviet duty officer yawned and stamped a form. Below, a sonar tech scratched a new tick mark under his console where nobody would see it. He didn't believe in luck. He believed in behavior. That's how they found the cable. The induction pod, listening without touching. They called it a pod because calling it a miracle makes people reckless. 6 tons of engineered nerve, 2 jaws lined with copper coils, edges radiused so a gloved hand could find them blind. It didn't bite the cable, it hugged it. The jaws closed until steel met certainty. Inside, the machine did the rude conversion, turning whispers into voltages, but the real trick lived in physics. No splice, no cut. Magnetic induction. a coil sensing the cable's alternating field through armor and insulation that never felt a wound. The cable kept its skin. The pod took its soul. Here's the science without the show. A Soviet shore station drove current down copper. That current threw off a tiny, predictable magnetic field. Wrap a coil around the cable, careful, aligned, tight, and Faraday does the theft for you. The coil listens to the field, inducing a corresponding voltage. Modulations riding that current, voices, teleprinter clicks, routing tags, become waveforms on your tape without a single molecule of their jacket disturbed. Physics as skeleton key, confidence as lock. And here's how it lived down there. Batteries like discipline, not bravado. Power cycles set by a clock that didn't care about weather. Recorders spun, heads tracing tracks designed to forgive salt and pressure. A tiny brain, crude now, viciously clever then, woke and slept on a schedule that matched shore office habits. You don't over-record chatter, you match it. The pod learned their routine the way a pickpocket learns cadence in a crowded street. Every retrieval was a dance you did without looking at your feet. Halibut parked on her skegs, took her breath, and sent down hands that had done this enough to hate it properly. Unlatch, tilt, slide the storage like you'd practiced dry 100 times, then forget the drill because the ocean never rehearses. Swap tape packs, check seals that had never betrayed you, not because they couldn't, but because fear keeps O-rings honest. Reattach, recheck the lamp. Leave quiet enough that the silt keeps its gossip. Risk stacked like coins in a jar you didn't want to count. Flooding, one bad gasket and months of voices drown in mud. Interference. The sea throws tantrums at low frequencies, and machinery hums turn to fog if you don't isolate power like a monk. Discovery. The Soviets didn't encrypt because they believed physics was armor. That belief was your cover and your curse. So you built countermeasures into silence, non-magnetic skins, edges that looked like seafloor, screws clocked so they didn't sing. The pod wore the seabed's accent. Get this, the magic wasn't just taking the sound. It was knowing when not to. You don't record for hero reels. You record for rooms where people drink bad coffee and change budgets with pencils. So the pod woke when shore offices woke, napped during lulls that matched lunch hours and midnight resets. Induced signal came cleaner when you respected human frailty. Physics helped. Anthropology finished the job. Meanwhile, the crew upstairs treated time like a living thing. Retrieval cadence became doctrine. You don't hit a spot on the same day each cycle. You drift just enough to be uninteresting. Storage swaps never at dawn twice in a row. Battery changes masked inside where the Windows barge captains used for their own sins. The pod's hunger for fresh tape taught you to say no. It always wanted one more pass. You taught it patience. Engineers fought the sea without dramatics. Electronics wrapped in desiccants. Drains designed to assume seals fail. Connectors chosen as if betrayal were a feature. One tech swore by a resin because it behaved like a gentleman under pressure. Another kept a tally of near failures in pencil nobody found because he burned the page when he shipped out. Longevity owed as much to superstition as spec sheets. Physics kept paying. A cable insulated against the ocean isn't insulated against the world. No cut meant no cause. That mistake kept them naked. A note somebody in Petropavlovsk would never love. Induced voltage draws stories out of copper the way a magnet raises filings from a desk. You don't have to touch a thing to change its history. Human rhythm threaded through steel. Divers counted heartbeats to measure calm. On deck, a chief carried the schedule in his jawline. He'd look at the sea and decide if the pod would forgive. If the ocean felt bulky, he'd call it. If it felt thin, he'd wait. Waiting is a weapon and a debt. There were scares. A pod came up with a sheen of something that shouldn't be there. A lamp flickered twice when it only ever winked once. An inspection found nothing wrong and everything at stake. Each scare tightened the ritual. Grease here, talk there, write off Providence and keep the checklist. Result, months of unguarded doctrine captured by a machine that never raised its voice. Strategy memos breathed on that cable. Exercise plans walked across it every Tuesday. Duty officers repeated phrases that revealed habit wearing command. The pod took it all and told nobody until the tapes spun behind doors with no windows. And under that certainty, a brittle truth waited. The tap worked because they believed insulation was faith. The schedule worked because you believed patience was armor. Somewhere far from the water, a man with $65,000 in debt and an alias thought context wouldn't bleed. That's the part the pod couldn't hear. The footsteps of a betrayal walking toward it on dry land. The first cans came up looking like any other hardware. Salt film on edges, O-rings behaving, labels in a careful hand. Engineers wiped, signed, and slid them through doors where chatter died. Inside, the tapes spun and the room changed shape. Strategy didn't arrive as revelation. It arrived as paperwork in motion. You hear an officer in Petropavlovsk walk a weekly brief like he's ordering lunch. Sub-deployments, exercise lanes, tug schedules for a pier that shouldn't matter and suddenly does. Commence Phase 2 sounds like nothing until you match the phrasing with a timeline that repeats every third Thursday. A planner underlined the strand and wrote, habit. Habits make maps. The tap gave more than chatter. It gave structure. Exercise plans in careful steps. Surface group drills tied to ballistic submarine exit windows. Patrol arcs pre-cleared with shore authorities. Refueling rendezvous that always slid 1 hour earlier when weather came from the northwest. Doctrine leaked between the lines. You could see a fleet's self-image, where it thought it was strong, where it rehearsed failure without saying the word. A micro-story lived on one strip. A shore controller said, "Keep channel clear for 22, too casually." 22 wasn't a frequency, it was a hull. Cross it with pier logs and a submarine, first at sea workup slid into view without a satellite in sight. An analyst, coffee gone cold, wrote 22 equals training track, expect quieting trials, and drew an arrow into a month that suddenly got interesting. Plans read like calendars you didn't know you owned. You learned when tenders took maintenance, when torpedo inventories swapped from training to warshot and back. When a political delegation visited, exercise scripts smoothed themselves and risky evolutions vanished. One line, protocol movement scheduled. Let Washington anticipate a week of caution across a fleet. Caution is a signal too. Comms codes rode the copper like fingerprints, not cipher guts, those lived elsewhere, but routing indicators, precedence tags, the tone a duty officer used to hedge urgency. Fast meant now. Confirm meant I'm not sure and I don't want the blame. A linguist in a windowless room wrote a note. They fear delays more than errors. That told procurement where to press and diplomacy where to soothe. Ship movements stitched into doctrine. A ballistic boat's departure aligned with air defense drills that accidentally covered gaps. Patrol aircraft lanes widened when a certain pier went quiet. Map 3 cycles, and the fourth stopped being surprise and started being prediction. Submarine tasking adjusted. A US fast attack slid left on a chart and waited because a phrase in a cable said a captain up north liked to cheat corners at night. Policy leaked too. Rebalance to North Pacific sectors could mean anything. Then fuel allocations shifted on spreadsheets you weren't supposed to see, and a depot's traffic dropped by a measurable degree. Numbers became weather. Weather became choices. A briefer drew 2 arcs and said, "They're nervous here," and nobody asked how he knew. The tapes had already told them. The pod hauled humanity, not just intent. A shore boss telling a junior, "Don't make this complicated," just before an exercise cut a corner. That tone echoed later as collision risk on a range far away. A commander advocating more diesel hours for a class that needed them, and 3 months later, engine failures dipped. You weren't reading secrets, you were reading people doing their jobs under pressure. Micro-victory, a young analyst heard an ordering pattern shift, request numbers bumped by 2 across 5 messages. It looked like sloppiness. She matched it to a tender's arrival and wrote, compensating for loading error, overage masked. That line fed a logistics brief that tightened a squeeze no one announced. Quiet pressure, no headlines. Meanwhile, tasking at sea sharpened. Patrol arcs that had been wide enough became precise enough to feel arrogant if you didn't know where the confidence came from. A US skipper eased into a basin edge not because sonar told him, but because paper did. He logged the contact 2 days later and didn't write, thanks to tape. He wrote routine. Routine is how winds hide. Ripple effects climbed into policy. Budget lines that had been placeholders gained verbs. Expand collection windows doesn't get money. Exploit demonstrated predictability in Pacific Fleet Movement doctrine gets a signature. The tap turned adjacencies into priorities. It changed briefing charts. It changed who sat at the table when men with stars discussed risk. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The hall did something to the people reading it. It made them sure that behavior repeats, sure that risk can be penciled, sure that physics and habit outrank surprise. And most days, those bets paid. The pod kept giving. The calendar kept winning. Until a satellite took a picture in 1981 and confidence felt like a trap. For those first seasons, the cans came back full and the rooms stayed dark and busy. Strategy memos, exercise plans, routing habits, voice tones, enough truth to tilt a map, enough routine to make you think the ocean would never clear its throat. The tap gave what all thieves want, not a jewel, but a key that fit every door in a hallway you didn't know existed. Washington used it, line by line, until the hallway changed. The vulnerable truth, a secret too big. Confidence grows quiet. It doesn't shout in briefings. It creeps into how people sit, how budgets get signed, how schedules become ritual. The tap worked. The cans kept filling. And somewhere between the 4th swap and the 15th, the secret stopped feeling like a miracle and started feeling like furniture. That was the vulnerable truth. This wasn't just a pod on a cable. It was a habit that reached from divers' gloves to policy memos, from skegs touching silt to hands on appropriations pens. A secret that big doesn't just live in a safe. It seeps. Money followed proof. Numbers shifted from pilot program to line item, from evaluate to expand. The operation that began with whispered risk turned into a repeatable plan with a calendar, tasking cycles, spares ordered as if you were stocking a grocery shelf. Votes were allocated with language that disguised faith as logistics. Maintain presence sounds benign. It's not. It's a promise to yourself that you can do this as long as you like without being seen. Complacency didn't arrive as laziness. It arrived as muscle memory. Crews trusted the pattern because the pattern had saved them. Analysts trusted behavior because it kept predicting. Managers trusted the pod because the pod had never failed. Each trust was earned, then made brittle by success. That brittleness hid inside paperwork, clearances that widened to include need to coordinate, summaries that cited demonstrated reliability without saying what relied on what. The circle of who knew grew, just enough for risk to borrow shoes. Rituals hardened. Retrieval windows became doctrine. Seal checks got faster because they'd been right 100 times. A diver shaved seconds he would have kept a year before. A chief who used to insist on the long checklist looked at weather and cut corners because weather matched the old notes. Nobody meant harm. That's how harm travels best. Washington built on the harvest. Tasking bled into other theaters, other systems, a belief that silence could be scheduled everywhere. Briefers told principals that predictability could be exploited as a method. In a corner of a secure room, someone wrote on a whiteboard, "Physics plus habit equals access." It was true enough to be dangerous. Security creaked where no one listened. The ledger of who touched the tapes, who moved the cans, who read the first passes grew long. Names flickered through logbooks, each with a reason. Coordinate transport, validate integrity, draft product. Each link trusted the others. Compartmentalization kept hard walls in place on paper. In practice, walls soften when people carry coffee between floors. The secret scale changed culture. Inside the submarine community, this mission became a rumor with rules. Don't say it, don't hint it, but carry yourself like you know things. In the analysis shops, the product got nicknames that sounded like jokes and weren't. Humor is how people manage pressure. It's also how discipline leaks. Up the chain, the success began to justify itself. Budgets expanded to maintain what had been created. Operations were scheduled to prove their own utility. A paradox settled in. The better the tap worked, the more it needed to keep working to defend its cost. That pressure pressed down the chain until a diver felt it without being told. He shaved another second. The ocean noticed, or didn't. That uncertainty was supposed to keep you careful. Instead, it made you proud. Here's the thread nobody wanted to pull. A secret that feeds too many mouths becomes a meal plan. You start planning around the assumption that the table will be set. You adjust deployments because the cans will be full. You brief allies on edges of the product because relationships like gifts. You tell yourself you're careful. You are. Until the day, careful means trusting the system you built more than the risk you began with. Meanwhile, the circle widened in a different city. A man who had once sat in rooms where acronyms had weight was out of that world now, but the world hadn't left him. He knew rhythms. He knew how silence worked as a schedule. He knew where the edges of compartmented truth could blur to make a shape someone else would understand. His debts made those edges look like currency. He told himself he wasn't selling a secret. He was selling context. Context is how big secrets die, one harmless shape at a time. The vulnerable truth wasn't arrogance. It was gravity. Success pulls mass. Mass attracts attention. Inside Washington, the success pulled money, people, and doctrine. Inside Moscow, it pulled curiosity, then suspicion, then action. Long before a satellite took a picture of ships loitering in the wrong place, the secret had outgrown the deep. It lived in routines, in confidence, in a calendar that could be seen from space. That's the thing about secrets this good. They don't just hide, they shine. Not with light, but with pattern. The more you rely on them, the louder the pattern gets. Divers kept counting breaths. Chiefs kept chewing on checklists. Analysts kept circling habits. And above them all, a clock none of them could hear kept ticking toward a moment when someone else would finally listen. Meet Ronald Pelton. Debt, ego, and a phone call. He wasn't a caricature in a trench coat. He was a former NSA communications specialist living in a modest place in Maryland, a man who'd learned the rhythm of silence as a profession, and then met a different kind of quiet. Unpaid bills piling up, phone calls that paused before a voice spoke, the dense hush after a bankruptcy filing. $65,000 in debt isn't an idea. It's a drumbeat that makes a kitchen feel like a witness. On a January afternoon in 198, he picked up a phone and dialed the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. He didn't give a name. He offered context. He told himself he wasn't a spy. Spies sell names, codes, sources. He would sell how, where the calendar lived, what we could do without slicing copper. He would never carry a document. He would describe a method he thought that made him safe. Hunger always sounds reasonable in its own voice. At the embassy, a KGB line officer heard the offer and pushed it up the chain. A few days later, inside a parked car, Pelton met a man who introduced him to a process. The handler never raised his voice. He moved slowly, questioned for stamina, took breaks the way professionals do when they aren't in a hurry. He tested the pitch. Could Pelton describe an operation without naming it? The answer came as a shape. Undersea cable, Sea of Okhotsk, a pod that listened by induction, no splice, no wound. The handler didn't smile. He said they'd like to continue. Pelton's ego took the wheel right then. He had 14 years of institutional memory and a chipped shoulder from a career that hadn't paid in respect. He liked being the smartest person in a conversation. The handler made sure he felt that way. They called him Mr. Long in debrief notes, partly for his build, partly for his patience. The alias fit. He thought long. He thought he could walk the line between betrayal and explanation and never take a step too far. Meetings were ritualized. A late-night payphone in Virginia. A slow drive to a safe apartment where the blinds were ordinary and the questions weren't. A trip to Vienna in 198 that felt like theater, a foreign capital, a hotel lobby with too much carpet, a room where the ashtray outnumbered people. They didn't need documents. They needed architecture. What did the pod weigh? 6 tons. What did it do? Induction, through insulation, no cut. How did the schedule work? Storage swaps masked as weather breaks. What did the cables carry? Policy and habit, the kind of language that feeds operations. Pelton described the red lamp blink the divers worshipped. He mapped the cadence without ever once naming Halibut. He explained how magnetic induction read a whisper and turned it into proof. He drew a circle around Okhotsk and put dots on it where boats like to breathe. He told himself he was still in the grey. The handler nodded and made it feel like art. Money changed hands, but not like in movies. No briefcases, no glitter. About $35,000 over 5 years in total, plus expenses, parceled like allowances to a man who had imagined windfalls. D asked for $400,000 at the start. He didn't get it. He kept going. Debt corrodes math until small sums feel like oxygen. Get this, he didn't sell Ivy Bells by name. He sold its vulnerability. He sold the calendar. He sold the confidence. If you wanted to check they were there, he said, you wouldn't look for the boat. You'd look for the pattern the boat can't help making. That line is the kind of sentence that walks a salvage ship to a spot on the map months later and leaves a pod-shaped absence where a secret used to be. Back home, Pelton built a second life inside a third. He worked odd jobs. He staged his own boredom. He showed up to ordinary things at ordinary times, careful to be forgettable. He rehearsed his story the way divers rehearse checklists, until muscle memory took over and conscience sounded like static. When he felt nervous, he told himself that context wasn't a crime. He was helping a competitor understand a game both sides already knew. He framed betrayal as critique. Most traitors do. Why did he do it? Debt is one answer. Ego is another. The third is lonelier. He liked the feeling of being necessary. The handler called on the last Saturday of the month from a payphone at a pizza shop in Falls Church. They spoke like men discussing weather. He'd get a number to dial on a public booth across town. He'd hear the same voice on a different line. That ritual gave shape to a man who otherwise felt like a plot that had run out of pages. Meanwhile, crews were still parking on skegs in the dark. Divers still clipping jaws around a cable because physics said it would work and history said it had. Pelton never met them. He just sold the map they were walking. In 1981, reconnaissance satellites watched Soviet salvage ships settle over the right patch of water and stay. A later run went back for the pod and found silt where truth used to sit. When he came home from Vienna the second time, he stood at his kitchen sink and listened to his house breathe. He had money in a drawer and explanations in his head. He'd tell himself again that names were still safe, that he'd only sketched a shape. Out at sea, a captain checked a schedule and felt something bend. Betrayal rarely arrives as a shout. It slips in as a sentence that sounds like reason. Pelton spoke softly. The ocean paid loudly. What Pelton sold, turning ears against us. He didn't hand them a blueprint. He handed them a compass. The KGB didn't need the pod's serial number. They needed its silhouette. Pelton gave them the shape, Sea of Okhotsk, a bottom that took skegs, a cable that carried doctrine because physics said it was safe, and a schedule that breathed like a shore office. That was enough. You don't hunt a ghost by chasing it. You watch for the clock it can't help keeping. In 1981, the sky blinked. Reconnaissance satellites caught Soviet salvage vessels loitering where nobody fishes for that long. Not a patrol sweep, an anchor-down, patient stillness, with a crane that knew why it had been built. The image wasn't dramatic, a rectangle on water, a shadow over a spot we loved too much. In a briefing room with stale air, someone tapped the photo with a pencil and didn't say a word. The silence in that minute felt heavier than any 6-ton clamp. A later run sent Parch back, quiet and careful, to check the lamp on a machine we'd come to treat like furniture. Divers slid through red light, reached for the jaws and found silt. Nothing to unlatch, no lamp to blink, just a cable that wore its skin and kept its secrets again. On the chart, the pencil cross that used to mean alive got a small hard X. The captain didn't change expression. He ordered the boat home. Discovery didn't announce itself as a taunt. It arrived as absence and then, weeks later, as the ocean feeling wrong. Messages that used to sound like breakfast came dressed as questions. Phrases we knew by rhythm turned stilted. Some traffic doubled, some went thin. A junior analyst wrote behavioral adaptation in a margin and didn't underline it yet. Meanwhile, in the water, ballistic boats slipped out of Petropavlovsk a day off their usual, patrol arcs bent, not by degrees you'd brag about, but by inches that dennied calendar bets. Pelton had sold how the pod listened. The Soviets didn't just sweep cables for metal, they swept their own assumptions. Salvage teams dragged the corridor like a man running his hands along a wall in the dark until his fingers find a nail. Counterintelligence did the rest. They seeded trapped traffic. a burst of urgent that referenced a meeting which never happened, a routine shift filed with an extra syllable. We bit once or twice, then learned to keep our teeth. They wanted proof we were deaf again. We gave them silence. They didn't encrypt everything overnight. That's not how institutions move. First came routing changes, then precedence tags that got stingier, then content that sounded like an office had been warned to stop using certain words. Commence phase 2 became move to the next step, and then became nothing you could hang a graph on. Encryption slid in like a winter coat, one department, then another, until the habit hardened. The physics that had kept them naked turned into an alibi for covering up everywhere else. On our side, the calculus was mean. We de-lost a window that paid in weeks, not headlines. Tasking shifted from exploitation to detection. You stop assuming doctrine will walk down a wire and start listening for the footfalls of a fleet that knows it's being measured. That meant reweighting what you trust, anomaly hunting over pattern matching, fusion instead of single-source joy. A briefer who used to sell underlines brought in blank charts and said, "We're back to building." Countermeasures weren't just technical, they were cultural. We changed our own patterns because Pelton had taught them to chase calendars. Retrieval cadences vanished, replaced by opportunistic windows that insulted planning. Fixed ears learned to nap and wake irregularly. The doctrine people stopped writing sentences that could be mistaken for schedules. On a wall no camera will ever see, someone wrote deformalize and circled it twice. Precision had betrayed us. A little mess buys time. Meanwhile, the Soviets ran their brooms along the seabed. Cable sweeps became a duty like painting a pier, boring, essential, never skipped. Where they couldn't sweep, they armed the wire with logic. Line monitors that noted inductive load changes you'd miss if you weren't paranoid. They built decoys, too. Auxiliary lines laid where geology didn't quite smile, carrying traffic that looked like importance if you didn't taste it. For a season, we chased a ghost cable that fed nobody, then taught ourselves the flavor of empty calories. There's a moment in every betrayal when the victim starts using its own pain as skill. We learn to spot trapped traffic by the way an author hides certainty. We tune to the slap of new encryption against old habits, the slight hesitation before an office flips a switch it doesn't trust yet. We watched for overcorrection, a captain who clenched doctrine so hard he left fingerprints. Each tell bought us inches, not miles, but inches matter when the other side has pulled your map. Here's the part that still stings. We didn't just lose a pod, we lost a method that had made us better at listening than planning. The TAP's success had turned us into connoisseurs of their routine. Its loss forced us back into our own invention. Some of that hurt, some of it helped. A chief in a lab said, "We forgot how to hunt, let's remember." Out at sea, a skipper stopped trusting paper and went back to trusting water. What Pelton sold wasn't a gadget. He sold timing. He sold the confidence that kept a nation unencrypted. He put ears in doubt and gave mouths discipline. The Sea of Okhotsk didn't go silent. It went cagey. And that's worse in some ways, because you start hearing your own fear in the gaps. The satellite photos made the case. The empty silt made it plain. The rest, the sweeps, the decoys, the scheduled nothing, that was the enemy. The ocean feels make us listen to ourselves. Early warning signs. It didn't flip from symphony to silence overnight. It bent. Operators who lived in noise felt the bend first. A watchstander in Iceland stared at a crossfix that used to land like a nail and saw it smear a hair wider than Tide math allowed. He didn't yell compromise. He tapped the gram writer, re-zeroed the stylus, and wrote odd layer because that's a safer story. Across an ocean, another watchstander circled a thin line that should have fattened at dawn and didn't. 2 rooms, 2 circles, no doctrine to hold them together yet. Patterns frayed where patterns had paid. A lane off Kamchatka that always hummed with departure chatter went thin, not empty, thin in a way that made you doubt your ears, not your job. A junior analyst poured coffee over a memo she didn't intend to save and scribbled, precedence tag stingier, tone cautious. Her chief glanced and said, "Ocean's weird this week." That was the polite shrug you give when you're not ready to say what you're thinking. At sea, crews felt it as mood. A skipper riding a patrol arc he could have run with his eyes closed leaned on the plot a second longer. He had paper confidence and water doubt. Paper had been right for years. Water doesn't care. He added a degree to starboard and didn't log why. Experience sometimes writes in pencil and erases itself. Micro stories piled. A cable route that used to read like a heartbeat now stuttered, syncopated, as if a duty officer had learned to step over certain words. A sonar chief in Wales ran 3 old tapes through a new filter because nostalgia can be a tool, then ran a new tape the same way. The old one sang smooth, the new one wore armor. He didn't call it encryption, he called it colder. He meant guarded. Arguments sharpened inside rooms that used to hum in agreement. Oceanographers pointed at temperature profiles and said the thermocline had shifted. Sound bends, that's what sound does. Operators pushed back. Sound bends, but not this way, not here, not this many days in a row. Management wrote both on a whiteboard and underlined, monitor. Monitor is what you do when you don't have permission to act. Meanwhile, families felt it in calendars that slid. Deployments stretched by a week, then 2. The note on a fridge that said back Friday got a question mark. A spouse asked why. The answer was a sentence without nouns, conditions, tasking, windows. You don't print betrayal on a leave chit. You absorb it in days that move. Analysts tried to prove themselves wrong. That's the honest part of the job. One ran a batch of cross-fixes through environmental models and pulled the shifts out as if waves had authored them. Another layered in shipping traffic, seasonality, solar noise, even an exercise off Japan that always muddies the record. After all that, a residual line still leaned the way fear did. She wrote, behavioral adaptation, and this time underlined it once. Paper fought paper. A memo from Norfolk floated through. Acoustic signatures exhibit reduced modulation artifacts, possible maintenance improvements. It sounded like good news. A senior civilian scrawled, or they know what matters, at the bottom, and folded the page like a secret. In another building, a brief with a clean title, Anomalous Transit Windows, sat on a table too long. Nobody wanted to lift it because lifting it meant owning it. On the water, cues went soft. A P3 crew that used to fly legs on a timetable watched bearings come a hair late, then a hair early, never wrong enough to accuse, always wrong enough to keep fuel in the air too long. A fast attack tucked into a basin edge that normally offers a telltale breath and heard only the ocean's blank. The skipper wrote, no joy, which means, I don't know, written for people who hate that phrase. Micro-evidence dressed as routine. A Soviet tender's departure slid 12 hours. A port's tug usage dipped during a window that had always been loud. A sequence of non-urgent tags strung together like someone was spacing speech on purpose. Each piece alone could be dismissed. Together, they made a murmur that sounded like discipline. Internal audits lit without sirens. A security officer circled printing logs with late-night spikes and called it hygiene. A counterintelligence lead requested access histories from rooms where cans were carried and got paperwork that looked too clean. No smoking gun. Just fingerprints wiped on sleeves that didn't admit stain. They decided to watch, because watching is safer than asking the question out loud. Pressure crept. Commanders widened patrol arcs to preserve coverage integrity, a phrase that hides we might be blind. A chief told his team to treat every clean lane as a trick until it was. A linguist updated a crib sheet with new euphemisms for urgency because people under supervision invent fresh ways to whisper. You learn that timidity has a sound. Then a whisper turned into a sentence you couldn't mishear. A junior analyst, 2 tour in, put 4 weeks of routing indicators on a wall and drew a curve that shouldn't exist. Urgent traffic dips mapped to windows when a salvage ship had loitered over a pod site a year earlier. She didn't write Pelton. She wrote post-81 adaptation. The room went quiet. Someone unscrewed the cap on a marker and didn't write. The ocean felt wrong because people had changed, not physics. That's the part that keeps you up. You can model layers. You can't model fear across a fleet that's realized it's been overheard. We weren't chasing ghosts. We were chasing our own former certainty, and it kept stepping just out of reach. The hunt, FBI, signals, and a trap. It didn't start with a confession. It started with a phone record that felt out of place. A number tied to a payphone in Falls Church kept pulsing on the last Saturday of the month. The call lengths were neat, measured, neither rushed nor wasted. Signals people flagged it, not as proof, but as a rhythm you don't ignore. Across the river, an agent in a low room sketched circles around dates and wrote one word: pattern. They didn't know the name yet. They built a box around a silhouette. The bureau moved the way carpenters measure twice. Quiet cars that never parked the same way, teams that traded shifts without notes. A small squad peeled back Pelton's life without saying it out loud. Bank deposits that didn't match his new income. Cash that arrived when no paycheck did. Not big, not flashy, just regular enough to seem like a second heartbeat. Copy shops told their own stories. A clerk remembered exact change at odd hours, and a man who waited while no one else was in line. The FBI pulled trash once, twice, each time leaving the bin looking careless on purpose. They found nothing dramatic, no tapes, no blueprints. That was the first tell. A former NSA man who never carried paper didn't stop being careful just because his wallet was thin. He was selling context. The Bureau needed to prove that context could bleed. Tradecraft met tradecraft in grocery store parking lots and apartment hallways. A surveillance team rented the apartment opposite a pharmacy with a loose brick behind it. They learned the rhythm of his cigarette breaks, the way he checked a mirror at one light and not the next. Patterns make cases. They don't scream. They hum until you can't pretend you don't hear them. Counterintelligence brought in a thin folder with a single idea inside: watermarks. If you can't catch a man lifting paper, you make the paper lift him. NSA wrote a memo designed to be irresistible: processor alert, logic, maintenance downtimes. The kind of bones that turn context into targeting gold. They seeded it in a place he could reach and waited. Days later, a fluorescent lamp in a safe house across town lit a ghost pattern only the makers could see. The watermark glowed. They didn't move yet. Inside NSA, an audit team did boredom like art. One lieutenant traced custody logs line by line, no heroics, just discipline. The same name kept appearing near the copier counter after midnight, not illegal on its face, suspicious enough to mark and slide up the chain. The memo came back stamped with the word that kept everyone slow: monitor, don't tip, let the bleed continue until you can count it. Surveillance tightened without looking tight. A sedan 2 blocks back, then a different one, then a woman in a winter coat who always seemed to be reading but never turned a page. He missed his Vienna contact once in September that told them he still thought the old ritual mattered. They laid one more trap: a staged brush pass behind a grocery store, a man with a newspaper folded to a crossword, a manila envelope tucked inside like a cliché. Pelton took the cue, made the switch, and kept walking. The teams in 2 cars let him go. They had the touch. Now they wanted the stash. Search warrants landed like feathers. Not a ram at dawn, a knock with badges and a calm voice. The office locker gave them neat binders, good custody discipline, a checklist written in precise hand. The car coughed up fibers, and a single strip of film leader wedged under a seat rail where only a nervous hand could forget it. The house offered crumbs: a binder sleeve with faint watermark residue, grocery bags folded with one corner creased like it had once caught a spine, a receipt for 2 rolls developed on a date that matched a drop. None of it shouted, all of it pointed. In the garage, black light made a spot on the workbench bloom, a film chemistry smear where no hobby should be. In a jacket pocket, a note card with a grocery list in his wife's hand, and a number in the corner that matched a fleet broadcast key list code. Small, almost shy, as if he'd tried to hide it from himself. The agents photographed everything before they touched it, because custody saves cases when memory fails. Interrogations begin as courtesy. They offered coffee. They asked about jobs he'd had. He corrected them politely, a pride tell. Then they put down photographs, the parking lot switch, the watermark glow, the film receipt stamped at an hour he told someone he was doing admin. He tried indignation, then expertise, the old line: "You don't know how this works." They did. When he finally asked for a lawyer, they paused, left the room, and came back with a tone that lives between kindness and steel. "This is bigger than you." Arrest isn't a scene. It's an elevator ride with 2 agents who don't speak and a hallway that smells like floor wax. Somewhere else, a task force started pinning pins on a wall, circling years when the ocean felt wrong. Capturing the man was easy. Measuring the bleed would take seasons. The trap had closed without noise. The signal they'd chased for months, the cash pulse, the payphones, the watermark, resolved into a name they could write on a line. And in a windowless room a mile away, someone finally underlined Pelton and didn't need a question mark. The arrest, quiet handcuffs, loud consequences. They booked him without ceremony. No press, no photos, just a form slid across a desk and ink that dried too fast. The agents didn't gloat. They didn't need to. The point of quiet handcuffs is that they don't echo in the wrong rooms. In a courthouse basement that smelled like old paper, a clerk stamped a date that would age slower than regret. Upstairs, the air felt colder because finality does that to buildings. Search teams went back through the life he tried to stage as ordinary. They opened a shoebox that held nothing you put in a shoebox if you weren't nervous. A spare key without a door, a payphone coin tray token, a folded map of Vienna with coffee stains that weren't his. None of it would headline a trial. All of it would teach a jury how intention hides. Interrogation gave way to inventory. The Bureau spread artifacts on felt like they were cataloging a small museum of modern betrayal. Film leader, watermark residue, notes with numbers that meant nothing until analysts matched them to the calendar of a pod's retrieval cadence. They pinned the pieces to a board and drew lines that didn't need to be read. Black ink was enough. People in suits with tired eyes started saying, "chain," in that low way investigators do when their work has moved from idea to proof. Impact rippled out in ripples no camera caught. A task force stood up in a room without windows and started counting what you can't see. Missed windows, thin fixes, red spreads on charts that had lived green for years. They moved pins on timelines and learned to hate coincidences. Before and after stopped being adjectives. They became columns. Numbers took the drama and made it patient. In those columns, you could feel the water tilt. The Navy took it like professionals and parents. Orders came down that didn't say panic but meant change everything. Retrieval cycles vanished from calendars. Doctrine shifted vowels, same words, softer edges. In labs, engineers wrote new software not because the old code was wrong, but because the ocean wasn't the same audience anymore. A chief at a console told a watchstander, "Treat clean like a lie until it proves itself." And the kid nodded and didn't sleep right for a week. Families got the version you give people you love. Careful phrases, schedules redrawn with no nouns, deployments stretched, shore leave retracted. A spouse traced a finger along a date that used to be solid and found it smudged. The reason was Pelton. It was caution wearing his shadow. 2 doors down, a different family wrote a note to a man in jail and didn't send it. Law did what law does when secrets meet courtrooms. Prosecutors stood in a room that hated cameras and said as little as possible out loud. They told a story without saying cable, without saying pod. Signals became a word heavy enough to carry a decade. Pelton sat with a look people call calm and juries call practiced. When the verdict came, it had the cadence of bookkeeping. Life. And then again, life. The gavel sound was smaller than movies make it. Finality often is. Inside the agencies, counters started at 0. You reboot culture when you've been caught believing your own consistency. Printers started logging clicks like they were money. Clearance reviews grew teeth. The system learned to ask why you, and wait for a real answer. People who hated process invented better process because betrayal doesn't just break trust, it breaks habits. The good ones admit it. At sea, skippers adjusted their math. Forward presence stayed, but the angles bent. Fixed ears were told to be less sure and more curious. SURTASS ships slid into lanes they hadn't claimed in years, painting water that used to be safe and now felt like a dare. The most experienced officers stopped using their favorite words. Routine went into a drawer and didn't come back. Meanwhile, the Russians did what you do if someone showed you your reflection. They swept cables. They trained crews to speak sideways. They staffed units whose whole job was to make a wire feel like a bad memory. Salvage ships learned patience. Counterintelligence learned humor. Men who once drank tea over unencrypted policy now paused and stared at their cups before they spoke. That pause traveled. Here's a human moment the file won't tell you. an analyst who'd built her early career on tapes that now lived as exhibits sat in a parking lot after a late brief and didn't turn the key. She had made a map with confidence once. Now she made maps with doubt. She wrote a note to herself on a receipt. Doubt is not failure. She stuck it in her pocket and lost it in the wash. She remembered it anyway. The lesson they wrote on whiteboards and didn't erase. Fix it, but don't let them know you know. Corrective action has a physics of its own. You move budgets without making noise. You buy doubt the way you used to buy certainty. You teach the next watch that clean is a story the ocean tells when it's bored. You make quiet your doctrine. Pelton's arrest didn't end anything. It reset everything. The handcuffs clicked, the door shut, and then the counting began. Tapes lost, windows missed, habits that needed killing. In rooms where nobody claps, they sharpened pencils and rewrote how to listen. Out where steel meets salt, a diver checked a seal twice and felt like he was part of the fix. He was. That's how you come back from quiet handcuffs. You build a louder discipline, and then you whisper it to each other until it sticks. Damage assessment, counting invisible losses. They called it a task force, but it felt like a morgue for missing sounds. A circle of operators, analysts, and quiet civilians pinned years on a corkboard and started pulling thread between events and envelopes. The stakes were blunt. If you can't see what you lost, you can't rebuild trust. Every missed contact might be a patrol that got close enough to matter. Every sanitized message might be timing handed to a captain who skated past our ears. They began with what's countable. Custody, cadence, cuts. Crosswalks went on the wall, retrieval windows versus detections, trend dips against known Soviet sweeps, the red spread of months that felt thinner than physics. A map of everything Pelton had touched got taped beside the timeline. The first calls, the Vienna trips, the watermarked lure, the late-night print spikes. A junior plotted them against the satellite shot from 81, salvage ships moored over our secret. The curves lined up like a confession. Action moved to the tapes we didn't have and the ones we did. They pulled LOFAR-grams from stations Pelton could infer by context, sites named only in footers, hinted by travel orders betrayed by budgets. Before looked human burrs and sidebands, doctrine sung through machines. After looked disciplined, shaved edges, precedence tagged stingier, phrasing that felt watched. Not empty, nothing so neat. Just quiet where clutter used to live and clutter where we'd learned to harvest. Then the part nobody likes, rebuilding with numbers. Expected intercepts versus realized contact time. Trail initiations that never achieved handoff. Probability of detection models, corrected for thermocline shifts, shipping noise, solar crackle, the whole catalogue of excuses. Environmental variance accounted for some. Genuine quieting accounted for more. But a slice too big to ignore mapped to knowledge they shouldn't have had unless someone gave it to them. Someone did. A thin stamped page from an old war game landed on the table. First night of war simulated assumed positions of enemy boomers built from patterns we had trusted. The task force overlaid the compromised window. The pins that once read likely turned pale. A colonel folded the page once as carefully as a flag, and nobody spoke for a full minute. Confidence had worn a uniform. Now it wore humility. Retroactive risk bled into doctrine. Discipline in the water became a phrase, not praise. You could see it in the curves. Narrowband ladders thinned under thresholds we documented in our own primers, transients that drifted where they used to sit still, routes that avoided choke points we'd bragged about exploiting. We weren't measuring their steel anymore. We were measuring our assumptions. A senior civilian wrote that sentence on a whiteboard and left it up until the marker dried out. The human audit cut deepest. Commanders filed quiet admissions, pushed forward due to lack of cue. Watchstanders confessed to nudging thresholds to avoid false alarms they'd been told were bad metrics. Engineers admitted bias in filters designed to ignore artifacts that had become the adversary's shelter. Together, the papers read like a culture autopsy. Not shame, clarity. Processes had learned to make us feel safe. The adversary had learned to live there. Numbers alone don't fix habits, so the orders went out with a surgeon's calm. Change keys faster, unpredictably, alter how we distribute them, rotate our own routes and timing windows so any pattern they'd learned dies on contact. Rewrite queuing doctrine, less dependence on a single layer, more on fusion and anomaly. A line underlined twice in a memo. Do not signal. Assume corrective action is observed. Fix it without telling them we know. Budgets followed in silence. You don't rebuild an ocean's ears with coffee money. Billions slid on paper from loud futures to the quiet present, arrays that could bend thresholds in motion, processing that graded behavior rather than worshipped signatures, training that taught watch floors to distrust their comfort. Someone joked that we were buying doubt. He wasn't wrong. Doubt became a line item. A micro story from the long nights. An analyst who'd learned grams at Barbados found her handwriting on a tape box from a decade before. A note calling a bearing line tilt, not the ocean. She traced the thread forward to a policy change that had nudged thresholds up to avoid false positives. She closed the loop with a fingertip and said, almost to herself, "We taught ourselves what to miss." She didn't cry. She sharpened a pencil and kept working. Allies felt the wobble and tightened the weave. Iceland fed anomalies Wales could test. Canada's arrays cross-checked Pacific behavior. Protocols narrowed, geometry widened, proof got more angles, not friendship, geometry. The aim wasn't to trust farther. It was to see wider faster, with less certainty masquerading as skill. In the end, the assessment wrote itself in an unfussy tone. Strategically significant loss of access. Adversary behavioral adaptation, likely informed by compromised operational details. Corrective actions underway. Between those lines lived the cost. Windows you can't reopen, confidence you don't buy back, time you pay forward so the next watch isn't gambling with ghosts. They boxed the pins, erased the whiteboards, and left the sentence every rebuild needs taped to a door. We will never know all that slipped by. That's not an excuse. Quiet rebuild. It's an operating condition, moving geometry. They didn't hold a ribbon cutting. They rewired the ocean in whispers. The first order was simple and ruthless. Stop trusting single lines. The static wall became a layered hunt, fixed arrays, towed arrays, shipboard sensors, and the quietest submarines slipping into places the wall never reached. Layered wasn't a buzzword. It was survival. If one ear was fooled, the others could catch the echo. Processing changed from curating signatures to reading behavior. Instead of asking, "Does this look like a victor?" the machines learned to ask, "Does this movement belong here now?" Engineers built models that knew what normal sounded like on a Tuesday in February and flagged deviations even when narrowband tones stayed clean. Anomaly hunting replaced signature worship. The ocean went from a zoo of species to a neighborhood watch. Math had to bend. Labs pulled apart beamforming assumptions and rebuilt them to adapt in motion. Thresholds stopped being numbers in manuals and started breathing with temperature, shipping noise, and adversary discipline. A watchstander could tag a faint behavior, layer riding, coordinated depth shifts, edge of beam dancing, and the processor would adjust, checking 3 ways before letting it slide. False alarms rose at first. Training burned them down without dulling the edge. They added deception to the toolkit. Acoustic decoys that sounded like predictable targets were towed where it hurt adversaries to listen. Noise-shaping modules let our own boats blur their edges, not to vanish, but to push enemy processes into wrong bins. Fixed ears fused with SURTASS ships into a moving picture instead of a static map. A memo made the philosophy plain. Don't hide in silence. Hide in patterns the other side thinks it understands. Culture turned slow, then all at once. Access rotated harder. No one person held enough pages to build a map. Printers logged every click, and the logs were read by people who weren't afraid to ask why. Lifestyle anomalies, debt spikes, sudden cash, shiny stereos, tripped quiet interviews. The new rule wasn't paranoia, it was hygiene. Trust the ocean less. Validate everything. Doctrine shifted at sea. Forward presence stayed, but it paired with deep ambush. Instead of waiting at choke points the enemy could game, we set benign traps in water where they felt invulnerable. A US boat drifted quiet, battery cold, 100 miles from any line on a peacetime brief, and listened for the breath even disciplined hulls can't suppress forever. When it came, the skipper logged it and didn't celebrate. He let it pass, then moved the trap a little, never repeating the pattern that had just worked. Geometry started to move. SURTASS ships, the long, slow ocean listeners, drew listening lanes where plans needed pressure, then seeded ground to fixed ears that had flexed their thresholds overnight. The network rotated like a wind farm catching weather. An adversary could measure last week's posture and still be wrong by sunrise. Software updates stopped arriving as big bangs. They became quiet increments pushed on odd days at odd hours with feature flags that could flip if the other side adapted. Timing itself turned into camouflage. Training rewired the watch floors. New sailors still learned tonals and ladders, but their instructors drilled discomfort. Every few hours, exercise controllers injected a synthetic contact that violated a cherished rule by a hair, forcing a call that risked being wrong. The lesson was blunt. You're paid to decide, not admire clean grams. A petty officer who once taped a gram to the fridge ran a module called Edges and told a room, write down what you want to be true. Now ignore it. Allies widened the picture. Iceland fed anomalies Wales could test. Canada's arrays cross-checked Pacific behavior. The circle didn't shrink, it grew disciplined. Protocols tightened. The point wasn't friendship, it was geometry. More ears, more angles, more chances to catch a disciplined hull acting human at the worst possible moment. Failures taught faster than wins. An early decoy fooled us in an exercise. For a week, embarrassing sat in subject lines like a bruise. The fix wasn't to blame the decoy team. It was to harden the fusion, require two independent phenomena before a weapon quality call. It made us slower by seconds, safer by miles. A micro-story from a station that used to feel cursed. Midnight, a thin line, a behavior like a hand brushing the wall. The watchstander called it out of family, got the shrug he expected, then watched the new analyzer light a box. Pattern of life says this doesn't belong. He pushed it up. 2 days later, a patrol aircraft logged a passive cut closer than doctrine allowed a year before. He didn't get a medal. He got another shift and a coffee. That's how confidence returns, quietly through work. Budgets moved like tides. You don't fund doubt with slogans. You buy sensors that fail gracefully, processors that confess uncertainty, training that rewards a clean no. The line items looked unglamorous. Redundancy, audit, latency margins. They were weapons. In the end, the rebuild wasn't about louder ears. It was about smarter doubt. A quiet memo closed the first phase. We will be surprised again. Build to bend. They did it in silence because broadcasting resilience teaches an adversary where to lean. The ocean didn't change its mind. We changed ours on purpose and made geometry that moved. The night, we almost missed it. Inside the war room, the air felt refrigerated and stale, a place where nothing living should grow. A projector threw a red arc across the North Pacific, simulated, but everyone leaned in like it could burn. The arc traced a launch track from water we hadn't seen, threading a gap that used to be covered by confidence. Timelines shaved themselves while the clock on the wall ticked soft, louder than breath. A commander stood by the screen, shoulders squared, voice low. He didn't talk about slides. He talked about a call he didn't make. One night, deep in the window, he had a soft cue, thin, late, probably wrong. He could have launched a trail, pushed a crew into crowded water. He held. If I was wrong, he said, I bought them time. He wasn't fishing for absolution. He was leaving a mark on the record. The sim advanced. A ballistic submarine, a dot in a sea of maybe, rode a layer edge we'd only recently learned to respect, then slid under a beam border, then paused as if listening to our breathing. A staffer clicked pause and wrote 3 words in the margin. We couldn't see. Not confession, measurement. Phones would have rung. Radios lit. The gap between detection and consequence shrank to a number that didn't let anyone sleep. Across town, a kitchen light snapped on at 3 a.m. A child padded in, hair stuck to a cheek. Where did Dad go? The spy's wife, eyes red from a night of not crying, said he had work. The refrigerator hummed like a shipboard generator. The child stared at the back door, waiting for it to open. It didn't. Silence puts its hand on families the same way weather sits on water, heavy, patient, unadorned. Back in the room, a declassified line slid onto the screen, stark, unadorned. We were lucky once. No context, no source. Everyone heard the second half without it being written. You can't buy luck wholesale. The commander who'd held his call rubbed his jaw. Luck is not a tactic. In the back, someone repeated it under his breath, as if saying it twice could make it doctrine. Human cost showed up in places briefs don't count. Longer watches, quiet kitchens, debts that didn't balance. A petty officer tracing edges in dreams. An analyst blaming herself for tidy models, then writing new ones with sharper teeth. On a pier at dawn, an officer whispered, "Be the wall," to no one. The ocean didn't change. We did. And that night almost wasn't a warning. It was an invite. Legacy, the long echo, and today's cables. From Ivy Bells to now, the wire never really left the story. We just changed the nouns. In the 1970s, copper on a seabed carried a Navy's heartbeat because physics made it feel safe. Today, 99% of global internet traffic rides glass the width of a garden hose. Same ocean, same quiet, bigger stakes. The long echo is simple. If it carries what matters, someone will learn how to hear it, touch it, or break it. Start with the hardware. Those old induction pods taught two lessons that never retired. 1. You don't have to cut to hear. Energy leaks through insulation, through armor, through pride. 2. Patterns betray us faster than content. The Soviets learned to fear their routine. We learned to treat routine like a siren. Fast forward to 2024-2025, and navies talk about seabed warfare like it has chapters. Deep diving platforms that call themselves research ships linger where cables converge. Autonomous vehicles roll on the bottom like crabs with degrees. Nations that used to tap copper now map fiber joints and repeaters, hunting the seams where invisibility turns to access. Incidents don't announce themselves with movie flares. They land as outages blamed on anchors, earthquakes, environmental stress. A cable off one coast blinks, then another halfway around the world, coincidentally, sees a drop in capacity. Crews in hard hats winch up wounded glass and shrug on camera because they can't say what they think. Meanwhile, insurance math rewrites itself, and stock charts recognize the sound of risk faster than press releases do. Quiet war leaves loud spreadsheets. Russia keeps showing up at the edge of these stories because geography insists. Deep-diving motherships with titanium nervous systems. Oceanographic platforms that know exactly where to loiter. The same patience Soviet salvage ships used in '81. Anchor down, do nothing obvious, let time do the camouflage. Now hides under flags that change names but not habits. You don't accuse a ship by what it says it is. You accuse it by how long it can afford to be bored over the wrong patch of sea. Here's where Ivy Bells bites our era in the neck. The old game wasn't just eavesdropping. It was knowing when to show up. Timing turned access into leverage. In 2025, that looks like maintenance windows published for consortiums and exploited by people who can read calendars better than headlines. You don't have to cut a cable to hurt. You can stage a repair that forces traffic onto routes that pass your inspection points. You can nudge latency just enough to poison trades. You can make one region feel islanded for a morning that costs more than a small war. The human angle didn't vanish when the copper did. Insider risk didn't die. It changed clothes. Paper became credentials. A tired network engineer in a coastal city is our Pelton with different debt and vocabulary. He doesn't need to smuggle film. He has an admin token and a reason. Context still sounds harmless in his head. A cable map on a wall becomes a grocery list of consequences if someone needs it enough. We tell ourselves zero trust is doctrine. Then we trust the person who's been on call 3 weekends in a row and said yes every time. Allies took the old lesson, geometry wins, and spread it across fiber. Chart the routes as a web, not a line. Build redundancy you can actually use, not just draw. If one ear is fooled, let 3 others catch the echo. Iceland doesn't just feed Wales anymore. Singapore feeds Marseille. Halifax feeds signs. Commercial operators learn to act like navies without saying the word. They share anomalies with competitors because physics doesn't care about market share. A cut in the Baltic teaches the Pacific what to watch for. That's not friendship. It's survival through geometry. Deception learned new tricks too. In Ivy Bell's days, trap traffic taught us about ourselves. Now trap maintenance does the same. An upgrade pops on a notice. An unlisted vessel drifts nearby. A sensor at a repeater hums the wrong pitch for 5 minutes. You file the jitter, not as proof, but as a habit. A month later, a second upgrade happens on the opposite side of the world with the same timing code in the paperwork. Someone in a room full of screens draws a circle around a signature that isn't binary, it's human. Adversaries leave fingerprints when they get proud. Policy finally feels the old gravity. Budgets move from satellites to seabeds because you can't launch replacements for glass buried under 1,000 meters of pressure. Nations write unhyped sentences. Assured connectivity. That means cables get guards, and guards get laws, and laws get loopholes adversaries will test. War game scripts that used to open with missiles now open with maps of where the world speaks to itself. A line through those maps shows how fast a protest in one city can become a market dip in another, because a robot with a claw had a busy night. If you're waiting for comfort, it's this: doubt aged well. The rebuild from Pelton taught a habit we needed. Assume the ocean is listening to you listen. Build to bend. In 2025, that shows up as private companies rehearsing sever scenarios with governments that used to pretend commerce would keep the peace. It shows up as machine learning models humble enough to flag, "I don't know," and send a human to stare at a screen at 3 a.m. and make a call they'll defend. It shows up as watch flaws where the best praise is still "good catch," not "nice graph." A micro story from last winter. A trawler off a Nordic coast reported a snag. Routine. A cable noticed a cough, latency jitter that looked like weather and wasn't. A junior at a network operations center wrote pattern of life off by 0.4% and pinged a list that rarely lights. An hour later, a Navy ship with a bland name changed course without announcement. Nobody tweeted. A week after, pictures of a repaired span circulated with captions about storms. That's how this era wins. Quietly, with geometry and doubt, and people who still enjoy being bored until it matters. The long echo isn't nostalgia. It's a warning with instructions. Copper taught fiber the rules. Don't worship routine. Don't trust silence. Don't build anything you can't afford to fix in the dark. The wire under the sea carries our markets, our calls, our lives gridded into light. People who learn to listen in one war are teaching others to watch in a dozen skirmishes you'll never hear about. You think the story ended when a pod left a scar on a cable off Kamchatka. Watch what's being wired now, and who's waiting for us to treat it like furniture. What we still don't know. Some truths never leave the vault. Some never made it onto paper. What we still don't know sits between those two. Start with the drawers that won't open. There are patrols that slip through windows we only discovered after the fact, if at all. Boxes marked with years and oceans hold redactions where names should be, and you can feel the shape of an absence without ever seeing the sentence. A few old hands will tell you, over coffee they don't finish, that certain arcs were disciplined enough to make it. They don't say where. That restraint isn't fear, it's craft that outlived the need to prove anything. Soviet archives, when they breathed for a season, teased answers and then shut again. Memoir fragments in careful prose, debrief whispers translated through pride, guidance that matches our worst suspicions without handing over the smoking line. You read a paragraph about cable sweeps conducted with diligence, and you hear the clank of a crane over Okhotsk. You read about training cadres correcting inadvertent radio speech, and you can smell the bottled air of a control room where men learn to talk around microphones. The shape is there. The measurements are. Then there's the ledger no one can balance. Did the pain shorten the Cold War by forcing innovation, or lengthen risk by granting breathing room to a fleet that learned to hide? The honest answer is both, and it never feels fair. Ivy Bells taught us to exploit predictability. Losing it taught us to distrust it. The rebuild pushed us into fusion, an anomaly years earlier than comfort would have. The breach gave the other side time to convert doctrine into discipline. If you want a clean verdict, this isn't the case. We don't know the full cost to deterrence because deterrence is a mood as much as a math. There are nights measured in inches on plots where a launch would have been a simulation without Pelton, and nights where the same inches look like forgiveness they didn't deserve. You can run models on either and get the answer your bias wanted. The ocean doesn't care. It's still there in the morning. We don't know which tapes would have changed which days. Intelligence is always cleanest a decade later, flattened by hindsight into a story you can tell in a tidy room. In the moment, it's handwriting on a box and a watchstander's gut. The pods pulled voices that turned into briefings that turned into orders that moved steel. Which move mattered, and which would have happened anyway. Lights up different depending on who's telling it and what they need to sleep. We don't know the edge between quieting and awareness in their fleet, not precisely. Some of it was machining, some was the pride of being watched. A captain who knows he's being measured walks different. He respects the layer in ways his father didn't. He lies to the wire politely. Tehran, Moscow, Norfolk, pick your city. The truth is the same. Once you've been caught believing your own routine, you learn to hide inside someone else. The curves we drew for engineering gains have Pelton's shadow in them. How much? That's the gap between statistics and a sailor's conscience. There's also the question we don't like asking out loud. How many future betrayals did Pelton teach us to catch? Insider risk didn't end in the 80s. Paper turned into credentials. Film became tokens. The dead drops moved into servers. Did his case harden the arteries we needed before the next stroke, or did it teach us to love audit trails so much we forgot to listen? The answer isn't a slogan. It's 1,000 small frictions that stopped 100 small losses you'll never read about. We don't know the names of the divers who shaved seconds and paid for it, or didn't, because the ocean chose to be kind that night. We won't. That anonymity is the deal. There are checklists with smudges from gloves that will never sit in a museum. There are jokes told in chambers that never hear laughter again. Those moments disappear by design. What remains is the habit their work built into the rest of us. And there's the last uncertainty, the one that lives under today's maps. We've wired the planet tighter than any admiral in 1971 would have dared dream. Glass instead of copper, light instead of voltage, but the same old faith in insulation. We can measure latency to the millisecond and still not know who's waiting at a repeater with a tool we haven't imagined. We can sign accords that say assured connectivity and still watch an ordinary storm story cover an extraordinary intent. The Ivy Bell's lesson is loud. You don't own what you depend on, you steward it. The part we don't know is whether we'll remember that when routine feels like a reward again. So what's left to say about the blanks? That they're not failures, they're operating conditions. Intelligence is a business of partials, of confidence brackets, of maps that leave the river uncolored because the weather changed. We know enough to respect the secret's gravity and the price of forgetting it. We know enough to rebuild doctrine around doubt and teach people to love being bored until the minute they can't be. And we know enough to admit, without drama, that some answers live where they should, in rooms without windows, on floors that smell like oil and salt, in the hands of people who don't tell stories because they're still writing them. One more line that won't leave the whiteboards. We were lucky once. Treat that as indictment if you need to. Better to take it as instruction. Build so you don't need luck twice. Betrayal sold time. Time measured in missed fixes, altered routes, and nights when inches on a plot were the difference between quiet and consequence. If you want to see how that same time is being traded on today's Seabed, watch what we've queued next. Subscribe for more untold Cold War operations shaping the cables and conflicts beneath your feet. New episodes drop weekly. Don't let the next pattern slip by while you're comfortable.